Welcome to Thursdays with Troy. As always, I'm Troy Lambert, mystery author, editor, super plotter, and your host. Today, I'm excited to introduce to you Publishers Weekly best-selling romance author of the Rocky Mountain Family series, Deb Kastner. Deb is the award-winning author of over 50 novels with over 2 million books in print. I'm delighted to have her on the show and talk about how she uses Plottr to outline her romances. Welcome, Deb.
Hi, Troy, and hi, everyone. It's nice to be here today.
Thanks. It is fantastic to have you. As you know, romance is one of the most popular and hottest genres out there in the world all the time. It's also very competitive. So, to outline and write a successful romance, your stories must stay true to reader expectations, and they must be tight and written well. So, tell us, Deb, what are reader expectations in inspirational and sweet romance?
Okay, for romance in general, you start with a meet cute, which is probably the same as most you'll see on movies, where you've come up with something clever as a way for the two characters to meet. Often it's very funny. That's why they call it a meet cute. And of course, romances always end in happily ever after, or at least happy for now. In these days, you can sometimes get a happy for now, but my romances always end up in happily ever after.
Is that because they're sweet romances? And is that kind of an expectation for sweet romance as opposed to just overall romance? Or can sweet romances end with a happily for now?
I think they can end in a happily for now, but this is just my personal preference. And I still think, by and large, the majority of romances across the board, no matter what, whether they're sweet or sexy, do end up in a happily
Should
ever
end up in, yeah, happily ever after. Is there a difference between the expectations for sweet and inspirational romances? Because your romances are also inspirational. There's a lot of faith involved. Are there different expectations with that than just a standard sweet romance, for instance?
Yes, I actually write sweet and inspirational. There's a little bit of a difference. With an inspirational or Christian romance specifically, readers expect a faith element that goes right along with the plot line. It's part of the character, it's built into the character, and therefore it becomes an important part of everything that the character goes through. A lot of times there is actually either some place where the character comes to faith, or else they grow in their faith. Perhaps they were having trouble at the beginning of the book, and by the end of the book, they have overcome that trouble.
Before we get there, are there any particular obstacles or roadblocks that make it challenging to write in your particular genre?
Yes, specifically for the most of the books that I write are for Harlequin, love inspired, and series romance has a very specific feel to it. All of the books are different, but they're the same, and
Right.
you really have to dig in and learn the pattern that the whatever series you want to write for has, in order to be successful, especially in 55,000 words. You can't have a lot of extra material. It has to be real tight writing, and to publish with Harlequin, at least, you have to have a really good sense for what series you're writing for.
Excellent. That is actually excellent advice, and it leads to my next question of where does Plottr come into your planning process?
I use Plottr, first of all, in my characterization. I use goal, motivation, and conflict with my characters to dig into their external and internal conflicts and make sure that I have enough conflict to hold over an entire book. And then I jump from learning about my characters, and I jump into plotting the actual book. And I do use Plottr for that exclusively, because I can see it. It works the way my brain works, and I can see where I have holes, which is always a big thing for me. As a published author in traditional publishing, you have to supply a synopsis and 3 chapters for every book, and I don't do well at synopses at all, and I almost always have to rewrite them. So Plottr's really helped me not have to do that, because I can see, hey, I don't have enough conflict or plot in a certain amount, in a certain place in the book, and then I can run to my husband and say, help.
Well, and that's excellent, because writing a synopsis actually is, I think that's a level in writer's hell. If you make certain mistakes, that you pretty much, if you have that writer crisis of faith at the wrong moment, it's possible to write synopses forever.
Yep.
But that is interesting that you use Plottr to drive towards that, at least. So I'm gonna share your file, your Plottr file that you've shared with me, and then we're gonna kind of walk through. And even though you start with characters, we're gonna kind of start with the timeline, because I like the fact that your timeline appears to be very character driven.
Yeah, definitely.
So we'll go ahead and I'll share my screen. And obviously, so walk me through your process of like how you start with a Plottr file as far as with your timelines. How do you organize your timeline?
Okay. Yeah. Well, I always know what my meet cute is. So I know how the characters are gonna meet. And I know what their original conflict is gonna be. So back here in chapter 1, my character arrives at Winslow's Woodlands, and they each have their own conflicts that they're wrestling with at the beginning of the book. So I always start there.
Right, exactly. So we see under the main plot here, Felicity Winslow anticipated the arrival of her teenage crush. So, you kind of have this, they're going to meet in this place, but they have their own conflicts going on. And I like that your timelines are named after the two, what I'm assuming are your 2 main characters.
Yes.
And each of them has their own character arcs that coincide. So once you got the meet cute, where do you go from there?
Okay, from there I jump to the end.
Gotcha.
Because in a romance, you always know, or I always know, it's going to be a happily ever after. So I go to the very end and I figure out what's going to be that happily ever after. And usually that coincides with the black moment. I know what scene or scenes happen right before the ending, so that I can work out how is this going to happen to where they're actually going to be able to be together. So in this particular book, my heroine Felicity, her issue is that her boyfriend had died in a skiing accident, in an avalanche. So she has a lot of trouble with avalanches. So that comes up a lot in this book. And when I get to the black moment, they're doing avalanche training, and the hero is in a dugout so that the dogs can find them, and the dugout collapses. So that's the black moment in the book. And then from there I say, okay, how does that resolve to where they can have their happily ever after?
Okay, that's really cool, because I know I've talked to another author who tells me he writes the last sentence of the book before he writes the first one. And so it's very interesting that you have your ending in mind when you start out. So then where do you go from there? Do you kind of go back to the beginning and work through to the end as far as your plotting process?
Yeah, I do. I start with whatever. I usually have some ideas in mind for chapters of what's going to happen. In this case, we started out going to an avalanche disaster shelter where the dogs can be therapy dogs, and they can help out the people that have just been displaced from their homes. And then I had an idea for a horse auction. So chapters 5 and 6 were the horse auction and what happened as a result of that. So at the time, chapter 4 was blank. It was empty. Um, and then chapters 8, I think chapter 8 was empty. And then, so all of the Avalanche, I had ideas that I needed to do chapters in training for the avalanches. And then chapter 10 was empty. That was the other one that was empty. And it ended up being a romantic chapter, but it it wasn't there at the beginning. I just had these, so I had these 2 blank chapters, and I could see it very clearly that I had blanks there. So at that was the point where I went in and did some brainstorming with my husband and said, what needs to go here? And he immediately pointed out that I hadn't really done much with the romance part of it. So that made it, it was very clear what needed to go where. So that's how I do my basic plotting.
That is excellent also that your husband is your partner.
Oh, he is.
Yeah, and helps you with those things. So let me ask you a question. So faith plays a big role in your stories. So I'm going to open this scene card and tell me a little bit about how Felicity's dark night of the soul basically drives the plot in this story.
Okay. Yeah. She was a person of faith. She grew up in the church, and then her boyfriend died in an avalanche, and it really shook her to where she was wondering, where God was when Trevor died. He was a risk taker. He wasn't skiing where he was supposed to be skiing. He was off grid, and he caused an avalanche and died. So she's trying to wrestle through where was God in all this, and on the flip side of it, Stone was kind of the risk taker, rodeo cowboy, bad boy, and when he got into a motorcycle accident, he ended up in a hospital for a month, and a chaplain kept coming to visit him, and eventually he came to know the Lord during that time, but he doesn't know what to do with that new Christianity. And the Winslow family is kind of a family who is very faithful. They go to church every week. And so getting paired up with Felicity and she's fighting to find her faith makes it, gives it extra conflict.
Gotcha. So how does Plottr help you keep that going throughout the story? Do you use that as part of your timelines to drive your story forward? And how does Plottr help you do that?
Yeah, I don't actually have a faith timeline, but by using a timeline for each of my main characters, I know where they're at, and their faith is it's just like faith is a natural part of my heart. It's not something separate. That's how I use Plottr with my main characters. It's just the faith is part of what's moving them along, and I can see where they're at any one time.
Well, that leads us to what we're going to talk about now, which is characters. So since you said that you start with characters, do you start in this part of Plottr and really build the internal, external motivations and goals before you start developing the timeline?
Yes. I always start with I always know my characters very well first before I try to plot. Mostly because, like you pointed out, I'm a very character-driven author, and my stories are very character-driven. So I start out, first of all, I don't know exactly how. I know what they look like. I just do. And so then I look for pictures or actors or whatever that look like what I'm expecting my character to look like. And then I make a few notes on their background, their backstory. And then I go to the GMC, the goals, motivation, and conflict. And I work out, what is her internal goal? What is her, external goal? And so I work all that out. here before I move into the timeline and work out all the outline.
So what kind of characters do you need in a sweet romance?
So in a sweet romance, there's not necessarily a person who's an antagonist. There can be, but a lot of times it's just the conflict itself that works through. It might be romantic conflict. It might be a conflict such as, in this case, how much risk a person wants to take in their life. As far as extra characters, this is just something I've done, is I build the town around the characters. And the town almost becomes another character. So in the Rocky Mountain family, the town is called Whispering Pines, Colorado. It's a fictional town. And there's places like Sally's Pizza and the ice cream shop that the readers start to get to know throughout the series. And of course, the church. There's a little church, community church, that are almost characters in themselves. And then the other thing with the Rocky Mountain family are, of course, the dogs, the service dogs.
Right.
So in each of the books, I have a service dog that does. There's no blind or hearing dogs in these novels. They're all doing something interesting, such as there's a autism dog, a dog that addresses epileptic attacks. They're disaster dogs, disaster service dogs, and also therapy dogs. And I've had a mobility service dog for a Marine. It's very interesting. I love doing the research on all these. And you can see down here the Dandy and Tugger. They're my dogs.
Yes.
Yeah.
We actually have a question for you that comes from a Plottr user that says, my problem is coming up with a conflict that is strong enough to keep the characters apart, but also not so big that it's insurmountable. So do you have any suggestions, one or two, for finding that central conflict for a novel like this?
Yeah, especially with romance, it's sometimes hard to come up with a conflict because obviously they're going to end up together, and the readers want to get from the beginning to the end, and at some point in the book they need to think, this is not going to work. Part of it is how you put your characters together. In Opening Her Heart, I had one reviewer that said, I absolutely hated Jake, the hero, in the first chapter. And I just was completely convinced I wasn't going to like him. But then when she saw him with his daughter, then, she saw the other side of him. He was kind of a strong alpha kind of guy and took a little getting used to. So by using characters, that's one way you can do it. Make sure you have external conflict going on. Make sure there's things that are getting in their way. Obviously, they can work together through some of that, but there have to be things that cause them to pull apart instead of work together.
Right.
It helps if you make the characters different in a lot of ways. And then, let's see, as far as plot goes, internally, I think also if you work out their goals and their conflicts so they're very different from each other. In this case, Stone is trying to learn about his new faith, and Felicity's trying to find her old faith.
Right. So there's a similarity there, but there's a difference in basically probably their approach and
Right.
the places they are in their faith, which, that's actually a very good way to produce conflict in this type of situation. I like your thoughts on that. There has to be something that keeps them separate. Now, I notice in your characters here, there's four. I do have some questions though, because in the main characters, you have their motivation and conflict, but I am missing some information about Tugger. So I just wanted to know if he's kind of treat motivated, or if he's more of a praise motivated dog. I mean, really, I want to get more inside this dog's head.
Yeah, Tugger is love motivated. He just needs a pat on the head, and Dandy, he's play motivated. He needs to have a toy to do. But they both they do what they do. They understand when they get their service dog vest on that it's time to work, and they are both really, really good with people of all kinds. I had the novel is coming out in July. It's called The Marine's Mission. I have a Marine, and my heroine pairs him up with a poodle, a standard poodle, and he's really not happy about that. But the poodle had the right personality and was the right dog to pair him up with. It took him the entire book to come to that conclusion.
Gotcha. Actually, I love that your dogs were a part of the plot conflict. That makes me very, very happy. So I do have a more of a romance-based question for you that's kind of leads in towards series. I know we're kind of looking at one book here and how you plotted this book, but how do you with sweet romance and even with other romances, how do you give a happily ever after ending, but one that still leads to the reader to the next book in the series?
That's a good question. In my case, I try to, like the Rocky Mountain family is 6 siblings. So I have been weaving in and out various siblings, either that they've seen in prior books or that they're going to see in books in the future, and also the dogs. I've been weaving that in and out. So that's one way. I usually, whichever book I know is coming next, I'll put a little bit extra of whatever character from Rocky Mountain Family, one of the Winslow siblings. I'll feature them maybe a little more within the book, so that it's something where the reader might want to know more about that character.
Gotcha. That's good, because there's a lot of different ways, obviously, to weave a series together, but having it centralized around family is actually a great method. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to ask you, are there any resources, books, courses, things like that you've used that have really helped you get to this point of where you are now in your career?
Gosh, I mean, there's been a lot over the years. I really enjoy going to the Novelist Inc. conferences. Always just to talk to other writers and go to all their little courses and stuff. That through that I'll go to one and my husband will go to another, just so we get the most out of those. But I have one book that I use pretty regularly. It's Beth and Ezra Barony's Plan Your Novel Like a Pro and Have Fun Doing It. I don't take a month. They suggest a month to do that, but as far as characterization goes, that's where I usually start. I don't use their plotting so much because I use Plottr, but I do. They have a lot of character worksheets, questionnaires where you ask your characters main questions and stuff, and I do a lot of that just to get to know my characters better at the beginning.
Excellent. It makes sense too, you being a character-driven writer.
Yeah.
That's actually a fabulous resource. So we'll be sure to drop a link to that in the comment section when we post this on Facebook. And then what makes Plottr the right tool for your process? Is there anything particular?
It works with my brain. I've tried so many different things that just don't. I spend more time trying to figure out the program than I do actually working on the program. So there's just something about being able to see well, like I said, where I could see where I was missing, I was like missing. I knew how many chapters I needed, and I was like missing whole scenes, and I was like, oh gosh, something goes there. I really love how I can move things around, just click it and move it to a different chapter. Because especially at the beginning when I'm trying to plot out what happens in each scene, sometimes, for example, the scene that ended up scenes 2 and 3 about the snow disaster, that actually originally in my mind happened later in the book. So then I was able to just click and move, and suddenly it was scenes 2 and 3. So that was awesome. I think that way, and it's very, very easy to use.
Yes, I love that visual ability and that ability to move things around in Plottr. It is extremely helpful. Well, thank you very much. Now, I know that if you've watched these live broadcasts before, you've seen that we always have a question of the day because we know that writers are the people that can solve the world's greatest problems and answer the greatest questions in the world. And since you are a sweet romance writer and we have Valentine's Day coming up, this question is related to that. Are you prepared for your question?
Yes.
Okay, so I need to ask you, dark chocolate, semi-sweet chocolate, or milk chocolate?
Oh, that's an easy one. Dark chocolate, definitely.
I appreciate that. And thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing your process. I love how character-driven it is and how concise it is for creating the type of romances that you do.
It's great to be here.
So thanks for sharing. I love the pictures of your book covers and things you have in the background. So why don't you tell people where they can stalk you? Find you and your work online.
Okay, I spend a lot of time on Facebook. I'm on Twitter, and the best place really to find me is at my website. It's https://worldwideweb.debkastnerbooks.com.
Excellent. Fantastic. Do you have an email list that you'd love people to sign up for?
I do, and it's right there on my website. So
fantastic.
Really easy to find.
Okay, everybody, thanks for joining us for another Thursdays with Troy. Thanks for being with us, and we'll see you next time.